Hi, my name is Ken Lasserson. I run the Microbiome Prescription site as well as CFremission.com, a blog focused on chronic fatigue syndrome and how to improve or eliminate the symptoms. Today's review is that of somebody who has chronic fatigue syndrome, has it 7 years, and this is his third microbiome sample. Now, this gives me an opportunity to see if what worked for me to go into remission potentially looks like it may work for him. 3 samples, and we're going to look at the 3 samples and what changed between each one. The first sample I already done a blog post on when he originally did it, and he took the blog post, followed the suggestions, or at least reasonably well. Did the second one, and at that time he went and did analysis himself, which is good. Brain fog must have improved somewhat. And this is the third one, which is good. It gives me an opportunity to see overall what is happening. It also allows me to see whether or not it is working, because I'm curious in things that do work, not necessarily saying, oh, I have this idea, I must be right. And so that's basically the background. Let's flip out and look at the thing. One thing I added recently is a percentile ranking of the number of bacteria by genus which are in the 0 to 10 percentile. Sorry, excuse the October there, transcription error. Thank you, Excel. Autocorrect does it to you again. And what it does, it shows the numbers in each category. In theory, you should have 10% in each one if you have a completely normal one. And down the bottom, I calculate the standard deviation, which is how far all these numbers are away from the ideal number. And then the second sample calculated, and the third sample. Notice what's going down. The amount of deviations from expected is going down and down and down. And we even have that having at the species level. Although we do have a blip there, and I should mention that species tends to be volatile, because we don't know most of the species. We do know most of the genuses and can identify them. So hence, I'm not too concerned about the volatility there. The fact that it then went back down after, well, it felt generally good. Okay, now I went and looked at everything for the general health report, and what we see is some bouncing around of numbers, but nothing great. Unhealth bacteria, not a particularly great change. Dr. Harlick's suggestions. We see the major improvement after the first sample. And the second sample will actually step back a little, but the number after is how many which were matches. So we have one less which are a precise match. So we sort of pretty much close to the same thing. Now, one of the things I do is I use the DNA of your gut bacteria and the DNA of probiotics to try to come up with suggestions of what probiotics would be helpful, because basically using the DNA I can determine what enzymes and what compounds are being produced, and using all 2,000 plus samples I can see where this person is relative to everybody else's. And if you are right at the bottom for a particular enzyme or compound, I can go and see, does this particular probiotic produce it? If it does, then take that probiotic. And the logic is very simple. Often the enzymes which are deficient are not available as a supplement, but they are available as a byproduct of probiotic. So that is how we go about doing it. So we see his first samples. Second sample, things jumped up to what I often see, about the same rate of them, and also the typical ones which shows up for chronic fatigue syndrome and people which are very similar, the same one. And then the third one, nothing, absolutely nothing. And I had to double check that to make sure it was not nothing, because nothing was being calculated, but actually was honestly nothing. And then we go to supplements suggested. The first 2 samples had only one particular thing, beta-alanine, should be supplemented with. And you can see that he was at 7.3 percentile. In other words, at the bottom end, he moved up to the 9.2 percentile. The third time, he wasn't in the bottom 10%. And I went and dug up the data and he was actually up to the 17th percentile. So we see that this particular compound is increasing naturally in his shifted microbiome, which is good. The other two things that showed up on the last one is L-histidine, which is available as a supplement. If you have histamine, not histidine, histamine sensitivity, you may want to be a bit careful here. And manganese, which as a supplement is available. So the first question is, has there been positive change? And the answer is yes. Nothing went in the wrong direction. Everything went in either stayed the same or improved. I did make a quick mention here of the classic problem with chronic fatigue syndrome, which is, one is you don't remember how you were feeling 2 weeks ago. Two, the MD doesn't have any objective tests, so he doesn't know if you're improving. It ends up all being subjective feelings from somebody with brain fog and lousy memory, and who can be quite volatile from day to day on mood and everything else, which means subjective tends to be problematic. And the other thing is, people are so fed up suffering from ME/CFS that they tend to become impatient. So, with that warning, he did give nice feedback. He noticed improved sleep and lower anxiety level, despite the shifts going back and forth. So, in other words, objectively and subjectively, they're having improvements. Moving forward, just basically as above, the two things there. There's a bunch of things such as NADH showed up, and because this is focused on chronic fatigue syndrome, I couldn't resist by dropping the literature on NADH and chronic fatigue syndrome. Well studied, it's beneficial. So just coming up as a suggestion corresponds perfectly with him having ME/CFS. And then I add a personal note. I took it when NADH was a brand new supplement on the market back about the year 2000, 22 years ago. First time I had an official diagnosis. Second time I had it, but first time official diagnosis. And what I eventually did was I switched to 400 milligrams of niacin twice a day. But that was only after my MD checked my liver function. And every year the liver function is checked because it can cause liver damage at that dosage. So you need to be careful, and you need to wait until your liver function is tested before you go into that action. And then went over and did the usual suggestions method, and we went through and we end up with all of the things and suggestions coming through, rice bran, etc., etc., etc. What I ended up extracting from the list was very simple. I ended up listing out suggesting a free probiotics which should be rotated, not continuously taking in probiotics. You want to take it for a bottle full or 2 or 3 weeks, then go to the next one and go to the next one. And the reason is that probiotics don't persist, with very rare exception. What they do is drop into the body some actual natural antibiotics. And studies have shown that changing antibiotics improves the response. A simple analogy is this. Take antibiotic A. It kills off 90% of a particular bacteria. You have 10% which resists. If you keep taking it, that 10% is still going to be there, and in fact, it may repopulate and fill up so the antibiotic stops working totally. But they found that if you go to a different type of antibiotic and do it, that 10% may be reduced again by 90%, so now you're down to 1%. And you go to a third one, now you're down to 0.1%. So you really are walloping the amount of the undesirable bacteria way down, hopefully to the point which the body immune system is able to take over the suppression of the bacteria which you are having a problem with. Now, using the same logic and you realizing that probiotics functions as natural antibiotics, They don't take up a system except for a very small number of bacteria. And so they are transitory. Most of them will not be detected 12 hours after taking them. So if you understand how they work and understand how antibiotic works best, you suddenly get a understanding. I gave a link to another blog post I did recently where we go into more details about how you should take probiotics. Typically at nighttime, typically you want to work up to a suitable dosage, which has been used in clinical studies, i.e. something deemed safe, and work from there. You are trying to shift the microbiome. And other things that shows up for supplements, iron supplement and magnesium, which is commonly used for CFS, and vitamin K. So we have 2 mineral supplements, magnesium and manganese, both. So that's basically it. Last thing, which I won't dwell much on, is I went over and used the new experimental page. I'm still coming to grips with how to use it, when to use it, etc. And in this case, I went in and I noticed he had 2 relatively rare symptoms for data entry: methylation issues and chronic sinusitis. So I went in, and to my surprise, I ended up being able to get a list of bacteria when I very strongly filtered it. And this is over about 40 people, and this is the bacteria types which shows up. All the percentiles here are ones where people with just combination of symptoms are too low, and then there are 2 where they're too high, which means these 2 are particularly of interest. And if you click on that, you can go over and take a look at what modifies it. But I went and just ran the usual suggestions using this as handpicked bacteria and came up with the list. And the list basically is, well, the first 3 things are all the same thing effectively. Licorice, which I've used and which does work, and I originally got that started using licorice as advice from Captain Dave, who was active on CFS FM experimental back in the 1990s. And it worked well for me, and we still have a big bottle of licorice handy, and I do take it occasionally to do it. It's slightly counterindicated, sort of. Literature has become unclear on it if you have high blood pressure, which most people with chronic fatigue don't have, so it's a safe take. He then came back and asked a variety of questions. And first one was ferrous citrate. He couldn't find it. I'm an ex-science teacher, so I knew how to translate it. It's just iron citrate. Swanson has it, other people has it. So first problem was, he already having terraflora. So basically, hey, perfect. He doesn't have to order anything already there. I did make a suggestion of, once he finishes his bottle, going over to a different brand for 2 reasons. It's cheaper for billing CFUs. Basically, I am very naive. I don't look for which one makes better quality brands. Bacteria is bacteria, unless it has a specific strain identified on it, and that strain has been researched. I really don't care. And what I do look for is how much it costs for every billion CFU in a probiotic. So I calculate that, and this one comes out much better. Also, Terrafera, I think, is 1 or 2 billion CFUs. This one comes into 6 billion CFUs. So it's going to be less capsules and easier to proceed. Very recent, he wasn't in the top list, but I checked, and it indeed is sitting there. And we also have this one, which is often called by name of Symbol 1, is sitting there too. I message there if you're interested. He has Akkermansia already in hand. Sweet situation, already have the stuff. Dosages, basically, my only answer I can give is just go with what's on the bottle. That's what I did. I had the positive improvement from it. It should be sufficient. NADH, basically saying, well, get your liver functions check, or And if there's not a problem, then fine. Otherwise, keep the NADH. Personally, I am using niacin over NADH. One reason it's cheaper. Two, I do like the niacin flush. It really, because it's a vasodilator, it gives a boost for oxygen delivery to the brain, as in more blood flows to the brain after taking it, and it assumes you can tolerate the flush. So that basically is the walkthrough of the blog post. Let's take a look at the actual walking through the site.
And we are on the website now, and as you can see, we have the free samples there. And looking at overview, you see the numbers here, and by just changing it, you can go and see the differences. And all I did was simply copy and paste from that, and as I'm going here, and then going over to Excel, and paste, there's the numbers, and then I just do a standard deviation sample. Oops. Okay, there it is. It's corrected. It's for the sample, and then I can just copy that over wherever I was. There. And that's basically how I ended up producing the table on the page. Straightforward. Health analysis goes in. You can see the number of items, the bacteria of concern, the percentile, and Jason Harlock's suggestion. So that's basically the first part of the post where it goes. Then going over to changing microbiome, and remember to change to whoever you're looking at. We have 10 samples there, and I can just simply empty the basket. And we can go through and just proceed here. And I'm going to just do a short version for you here. Get suggestions, go back. I'll do standard labs, which again is a very sparse one. You can see just 2 bacteria. We do a fair number of suggestions from it. And box whiskers. Cut off Moltrop. And the top bottom 10% for the last one. So that gives us, when we go back and refresh this page, you see we have 5 packages. Now, what I did do also was go over to the research, and we have experimental. It is labeled experimental because it is experimental. I have not had, it's a thought processing, wait a minute, can't we do this, blah, 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 blah. Now comes the question of how do we do it properly, and the aspect about, oops, let's go to the right person. That's the aspect of it is we have the symptoms here. Is if you focus on 1 or 2 symptoms, you may improve those 2 symptoms, but other symptoms could get worse. So there is a bit of risk there. And what we can do is actually go in and take a look at a couple of things. Like, for example, high anxiety was one of the things he cited. Inability for deep sleep. Actually, notice we're only going to do one thing at a time because it is a build up. Where do we have high anxiety again? There we go. Select one item, add it, and then everything else gets recalculated. And you can go in and add in whatever other items you wish. We could add in actual sleep apnea if we want. In which case we only have 2 things left. We could add in neurological, which will actually take us down to just 22 samples for our analysis. Click here, and we see a rather massive list over the 22. The smaller the number of samples you get, the more likely you are to get a bigger collection showing up. If you have a big sample, you're more likely to have a smaller collection. Let's go over to strong and see what comes up. There we have things which have strong associations with those two. We could go back one more and see if we can get very strong. And we have one and only one thing here. It's high. Again, if you click here, you'll go over and get information about what increases or decreases. In this case, we have a grand total of 13 items. That's it. And since we are high, we want to decrease it. So flaxseed, again, another version of flaxseed, Bifidobacterium increases those are the only things which we know which decrease them. So for those items, that's the very focused one, again taking a risk of side effects. Okay, so that covers basically the thing, except we need to go back and do changing the microbiome. And if I do a refresh here, we can now go in and just take a look at the basket concession. And there we have things listed by highest priority downwards. And the number and what you do determines what the priorities are. In this case, HMOs is the top of the list. There we can go in and focus on specific things such as probiotics and actually I need to go back and double check because I think I am looking at the wrong one. I was looking at the original, and what happened was I had gone through the whole process for one of his old samples. My mistake. Something to keep in mind. Watch what sample you're working with. But that's basically illustrated. So that's basically it. Key thing always, any suggestions should be reviewed by your knowledgeable medical professional before starting, regardless of how simple they are. And the second thing is, these analyses are always free. If you are one of the fortunate ones who actually don't have cash problems, a lot of people I'm dealing with have cash problems on disability or on social security, or in the case of people with autism kids, they're spending a fortune on other things like therapy, etc. If you happen to be one of the fortunate who have a surplus of funds, I do take donations to help cover the operating costs. As this project goes on, I keep having to upgrade my accounts for more memory, for more disk space, etc. So if you have surplus, send a amount over, even if it's nothing more than enough money to buy me a latte while I do your analysis. Then that's it. Think about, hey, are you going to spend the coffee on me? If so, and you have the surplus funds, make a donations. Okay, I'm going to shut up here, and we should be done.